Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don, I'm joined today by Alexis. How are you doing today, Lex?
Pretty good.
Yeah, we are taking a couple of minutes today with a non-normal episode. This is not going to be in our normal episode rotation, so this is not costing you anything as a valuable episode this week. But we're recognizing the fact that our podcast is having a golden anniversary. Now, we're only measuring that in terms of episodes. But I just finished uploading and recording episode number 50. So congratulations, Alexis. We have a 50 episode podcast.
Yay.
Yay. And some said it would never last.
Well, I was looking at the feed this morning, and I've been pretty heavy the last few episodes, so it's nice to hear your voice again.
Yeah, it's good to hear yours too. And like you mentioned, I think in your episode, which is just released, which some of our listeners have already heard, with all that's going on now with the pandemic response globally and the way our schedules have changed and where we are, there's a little bit more time to listen to podcasts. So I've been doing that as well, and hopefully folks have been finding ours too. What I wanted to do today was a little bit like what we did for around the 25th episode, which is sort of a little bit of a retrospective. And I also thought we would collectively throw out some questions again to our listeners about sort of the direction that we want to go in. So I'm going to start this looking back at 50 episodes scenario the same way I think I started when we did this, looking back at 25 episodes. What is exactly what you expected about being at least a part-time podcast host, and what is different than you would have expected, Lex?
Well, I'm a little bit more of a full-time podcast host recently, but I think my answer is probably pretty similar to what it was 25 episodes ago. I expected to have an outlet, obviously, to be able to talk about history. Of course, you know I talk about history all the time, even when I'm not recording episodes. I just like talking about history. So I expected that. But what I didn't expect was to find so many people who also found the topics relevant. And also found them interesting. Obviously, I've got friends. You and I both have mutual friends that we talk about history with. But I've met people through the podcast that I thought that might happen, but I didn't really expect that to happen. At least maybe as quickly as it did. So that was a pleasant surprise that I discovered.
Yeah, I would concur with that. And again, hopefully this doesn't turn into. And now at 50, we're going to tell you all the things we told you at 25. But I think, in fact, I'm actually pulling it up now because I don't want to make an assumption just off the top of my head. But very early on, I realized as much as possible what we think of as being the solo or the monologue episodes normally aren't as good as when it's either you and me or you and somebody else or me and somebody else where we bring in guests to that. So I'm looking back now. Yes, it was episode 7. I knew that when I had the first guest on, which was Ryan. And then in the first 25 episodes, there were 4 episodes that included a guest host other than you and me. And since then, we've done about that same number, actually a little bit more. As I look here, we actually have a spreadsheet. I don't know if Alexis has it up in front of hers. We're remote from each other right now. But I noticed there, by the way I have it color-coded, that's right, it's color-coded, ladies and gentlemen. There are 5 episodes spanning from episodes 26 and forward that include guest hosts. And some of those have been on now multiple times. So I think our listeners are probably getting pretty familiar with Brant Frost. But then others as well, Ross and Ryan and others that are there. So I don't think I expected almost a year ago when I started this to have as much participation by guest hosts, and I certainly didn't expect it to be people that I didn't even know.
Yeah, I mean, I know Ryan. I've grown up with Ryan my entire life. In fact, there's another episode that Brian and I talked about doing, but then this thing called COVID happened and schedules got messed up. So I actually need to be reaching out to Brian here in the next few days to try and figure out when we can do that. But yeah, people that we don't even know before. I think I've met Ross a couple times, but you knew Ross obviously. But then we have people like Brand, people like Chris, people that I've never met. I still haven't met in person. I've met them virtually, but that's
Right.
been really cool and really exciting.
Yeah, and that's one of the things just throw out to our listeners here. That's one of the things we want to continue to do because I like the diversity. Certainly, one of the things that impressed me about Brent when he first reached out, and he's part of what started with the thing there is he's a patron, he's a Patreon supporter, and one of the things we said you definitely can be a guest host on an episode if you're part of that. But when Brant put together the first episode that we did together, I'm looking here now, that was episode 30. So that was 20 episodes ago. And that was a Let the Wilkie Win back in December of last year. When he first sent over to me his outline for his alternative history with a Wilkie win in 1940 in the United States presidential election versus Roosevelt electing for a third term, it was detailed.
Yep.
It was actually more detailed probably than anything I had done for internal prep. Part of just the way that he approaches things. And those of you that, for example, listen, not just uh, making it all about Brent, because I think the other guest hosts have had good episodes as well and bring a different perspective. But if you look at the two-part American Hannibal there, which is also again Brent putting forth an outline of history. I think it added something to the podcast. If you go back and look at our most listened to episodes, some of those include him and include some of the other guests. And I don't think that's accidental. Part of that is because, they mentioned that they're on it and they have their friends maybe that just listened to that episode. But I think part of it is those are the most compelling episodes that people find and come back to.
I definitely agree with that. I listen to our podcast. I listen to the episodes that I'm not on, and the ones that immediately do stick out in my head are the American Hannibal with Brant, the 42 revisited with Ryan. Talk about research. Ryan did a lot of research for that one. Then the Beatles episode with Ross was one of my favorites. So yeah, I agree. I think having guest hosts, not that I don't love talking to you, not that I don't love doing episodes by myself, but I think having guest hosts really do boost the podcast.
I agree, and it's one of the things. Part of what I mentioned here. This is sort of a look back, but also a look forward. So imagine, if we will, we're including our listeners in on a planning meeting for the podcast. One of the things that I want to do with this much more moving forward is have more of that and the diversity that comes with that. The episode that we did, episode 47, which was about Operation Barbarossa, was the first time that we included a panel of, I guess, of four, including me and you, also with Brent and Chris, who had also been on the podcast before. And I really like the ability of not just you and me playing off of each other, talking about what ifs, but other people playing off their what ifs and sometimes even disagreeing about those what ifs. I think that's a powerful element that we add to the podcast. And one of the things I'm actually most proud of, it's not because we planned it this way, but it sort of worked out this way, is that I think each time somebody tunes in to listen to an episode of A Fork in Time, they get something a little bit different. Sometimes it is the single host episode, either you or me. Sometimes it's you and me together. So it's two hosts. I don't think of either of us being the guest host on those. It's just a two host. It's a two-headed episode versus a one-headed episode. But then you get an episode with an invited guest. You get the other things, and then so it's a different format, and maybe that's good or bad that we vary the format. Some people say it ought to be more of the same format all the time. I'd love to get, by the way, all of this we'd love to have feedback on. We keep saying
Yep.
go and visit the website and give us the feedback. Give us feedback on what we've just said there, whether you think that's the better or worse. I really do encourage you to take the little simple survey we have there, because it asks questions like that in a structured way that gives us something we can look at and digest the answers a little bit better. But I'm also very proud. The other thing I'd say I'm very proud of is we try to bounce around in where we are in history and what the topics are about. I mean, when you've had episodes that are about Barbarossa, which is a massive military operation in World War II, and you've had an episode about the Beatles, I think you've stretched the spectrum a little bit.
Yeah, those are two opposite ends of that spectrum there.
Yeah, and so one of the things I'm most proud of, in fact, I intentionally think about, we sort of joke about the fact, and it's okay because I know from comments and feedback that we have from some of our listeners, they really enjoy the uh, the English Anglophile um, uh, centric episodes, which sometimes tend to be Alexis, although she doesn't exclusively do that. That's an unfair thing to lay on her. But I do like the fact that we bounce around both in terms of when we are in history and what we are in history.
Yeah, and I do like the fact that we try and tie it into whether it's an anniversary or something really timely. Specifically, this last episode we released, that we actually released, it's in your feed, is on the Titanic, and it's relevant for a couple reasons. One, we just passed the anniversary of that sinking, but also it's talking about hospital ships, which is a very relevant topic right now. So we try and do that too. We not just trying to. I mean, obviously we do the topics where we kind of just it's something that interests us, but also we try and do stuff that's timely.
Right. And I think we're doing a good job of that. Obviously, we're continuing to learn this process. And I guess the others, talking about the surprises that are here, I can tell the episodes where I was better prepared versus the episodes where I was not as prepared. Although some of our actually better rated episodes, ironically, rated here being number of listens, at least one of them I can think of. I will not tell you which one it is because I'm not going to let you behind that part of the curtain. But
He'll
I
tell
had
me
done.
after we stop recording.
Yeah, we will. I'll share with Alexis. It was actually one that I had thought about a lot, but in terms of actual preparation online, doing the research, which I think is valuable for us to do, we really do try to do that. I had spent very little time actually doing the research. It was almost, and I don't want to say that it was an ad hoc episode or that it was an off the cuff kind of episode, but it was much more off the cuff than others that I've done a tremendous amount of research on, but actually found them more difficult to relate or record. In fact, to me, sort of the trade-off that happens there is sometimes the better prepared you are, you've got so many ideas running through your head that it's hard to focus, down to a couple of ideas that are more easily expressed or that are more tightly expressed. I'm known for being long-winded. The joke in my office is, can you give me a short answer? And the answer is no, because I got to give you the background. That's just how I'm wired and how I like to communicate. But that's been one of the findings for me is that obviously preparation matters, but sometimes the way you prepare and being more on the fly can actually be a benefit.
Yeah, and what's funny is I'm almost the opposite. I can be long-winded, but I think it's the training I have with my job where I have to do, on-camera interviews, and it's like you have 2 minutes, and it's like, okay, I have 17 things that I have to somehow get into 2 minutes. So I'm almost the exact opposite in that I try and pack as much information into a short space of time as possible because I
Yeah,
have to.
yeah. And in fact, you have now said, at least running through episode 49 that's published, you have set the record for the shortest episode with episode 49, The Unsinkable Hospital. So much so that we may come back and revisit that. If you haven't listened to that episode yet as a listener, shame on you, because it'll only take you slightly more than 10 minutes to do so. But and that's okay too. I mean, part of what we've also, to be honest, again, sort of pulling the curtain back for our listeners, struggled with. I know we have some episodes that are very long, that run against the grain of what anything you read about producing a podcast suggests. They suggest that you should really target your episodes to be about 30 to 45 minutes in length, and going longer than that is problematic. Going shorter than that is not bad, but then sometimes maybe you're skipping on the content. And Alexis, we haven't even talked about this off podcast or off this recording. Why do you think they suggest 30 to 45 minutes?
I think mainly that's because that's a typical commute time.
That's exactly right. They'll tell you that you normally want to contain an episode into what is somebody's typical commute, whether they drive
Granted,
that.
we live in Houston. Commutes can be a lot longer than 30 to 45 minutes, but
Right.
typically.
But that's why the suggestion exists. And I think the suggestion is absolutely perfectly valid for the reasons that it is. But I also know from my own podcast listening experience, if somebody has an interesting topic, I'll listen to the 2-hour podcast in 3 parts. And so while I think we're intentionally trying to do a better job of keeping them down, to a 45 to 60-minute time frame at the most. And by the way, that's one of the questions on the survey. If you will go and take the survey, so let me plug the survey a second time there, because the listener survey. We understand that. I'm also realizing that sometimes a topic deserves more than a 30-minute treatment. And so the tricky part there is, do you turn it into a 2-part episode, or what do you do? And again, we want your feedback on those types of things. We've done a little bit of that. But I don't know if our listeners prefer that. What you always see, by the way, when you look at the statistics, is part two never gets as many listens as part one. And I don't know if that's because people are just not as likely to come back if it's not new material, or okay, this didn't really interest me. I listened to the first one, but I'm not going to come back for part two. So that's just one of the interesting things when you look at statistics behind the scenes. Like, part two never has as many listeners as part one.
Yep.
So just some of the stuff that's there. What else would you like to hear from listeners in terms of feedback? If you had our, and again, just being candid here, our statistics that are gathered by Buzzsprout tell us we have a regular listener base probably of about 250 to 275 listeners, depending on how it's calculating that metric. And just so you know what that is, that's the expectation of how many people will listen to an episode within its first 90 days after release. So if you can get those 250 people in a room and ask them some questions, which is sort of what we're doing now, just virtually, what would you want to hear back from them, Lex?
I mean, we've talked about, what interests them, whether that's time period, that's section of the world, that's a specific person. I think that question can take a lot of different forms when it's just like, what interests you? Well, it's like that question is multifaceted. So it's what time period interests you? What area of the world interests you? Is there a specific figure that interests you? I think that's what I really want to hear. People can say, "Oh, I like 18th century." Okay, you like 18th century what? Do you like ancient 18th century American history? That's very different than 18th century Asian history.
Right.
So it's being specific about what you want to hear about, because that'll help us in turn be able to drill down and do that research and do that due diligence so that we can bring those topics.
Well, and the other thing that goes with that, and I would just echo that too, is that I will be the first. I think I mentioned this on the episode that I did with Chris Coppola, the one about Annie Oakley maybe shooting Kaiser Wilhelm. I would be the first to tell you that while I consider myself to have a pretty good general grasp of world history and the flow of world, particularly the flow of world history, when you get down into levels of detail about 19th century European history, that is not a strong suit for me. Now, it is a strong suit for Chris, as was well demonstrated on the episode, and for others as well. Brant, later when we were talking about the Barbarossa episode, both Brant and Chris were on there. That's part of the reason I like to reach out to other folks. But there can be incredibly compelling topics that we can do that may deal with Asian history that I just don't know that they exist off the top of my head. And
Yeah.
so that's why feedback from our listeners, not just in the U.S., but I know we have global listeners. I love to look at the map to see where people are listening from. That's actually one of the cool things about this that, again, I didn't know was going to be cool. But if you want us to branch to other parts of the timeline and other parts of the geography, sometimes that's just making us aware that there's an interesting topic out there that's not front of mind for us. It doesn't mean that when you mention it, I may not say, "Oh yeah, you're right." I may know something about it off the top of my head, but I encourage folks to do that. The diversity comes from our listener diversity, if that makes any sense. Does that make sense, Lex?
Yeah, it does. And another thing that popped in my head while you were talking is, I think you were talking about how 19th century European history is not your strong suit. So you were doing research and you sent me that horrible histories video. I'm interested to kind of hear from our listeners what they kind of find in terms of history, kind of pop culture things. Is it something like horrible histories on YouTube, which I find horrible histories hilarious, by the way? Is something like horrible histories? Is there a certain author, which we talked about, fiction focus? Is there a certain author, alternative history or regular history, that you've fallen in love with and that you really enjoy? Is there a specific podcast other than ours that you enjoy? Is there a TV show? Is there a series? I kind of want to hear from our listeners what other influences they have, because again, I can learn from that, and I can kind of broaden my horizons. They might tell me about something that I've never heard about before.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then again, one of the things always want the podcast to be, and want you and I to be, as candid with our listeners. Um, I I am not going to submit www.aforkintimepodcast.com for any award consideration. It is not an award-winning, super slick website. I'll be candid, it's built on the Wix back end, which I've come to learn a little bit better and use. However, having said that, I think what we've built at the podcast is for the website for the podcast is a very functional website in terms of it loads pretty well on mobile devices. It's simple. In modern sort of website design, which I work with the marketing personnel at my company. Although I'm in sales, I'm not in marketing. I know what you want a lot of times with a website is something that is very quote unquote clean. That's what's talked about. And
Yes.
so my goal with our website was to have it be clean, to have it be functional. Now we've added stuff to it and it's grown and some things that are there. But one of the things that surprised me, I don't know if this is a good surprise or a bad surprise. I think if you listen to every episode we've ever published, ever since I got the URL, which was very early on, since I secured the website and made sure that it had something that was, a regular, easy to access .com kind of website. Is it fair to say, Lex, we probably mentioned it on every show?
Uh, probably yes.
Yeah.
Probably.
And it's certainly in the show notes of every show. So there's the reference there to what's clicked there. I'll be honest, it should not surprise me, but I'm throwing this out here for our listeners. Podcasting is very much a what kind of medium? It's an audio medium, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's primarily a one-way audio medium. The host or the producers talking to their audience, and we're thankful to have an audience. But I actually was a little surprised, and maybe it's the nature of our audience. Our audience is not as large as it is, or how it's grown, that we don't get more feedback via the website from our audience. Does that surprise you?
A little bit, just because I can't put my finger on why that surprises me actually, which is
Surprising.
yeah, surprising. But it did surprise me a little bit, just because I see the reports every week. I know we have listeners, so I guess it just kind of surprised me that those listeners aren't going to the website. But I know they're going to at least our Facebook page. So
Right.
they're
Yeah,
going somewhere.
yeah, and that's actually the thing that I think I realized too is, maybe I had expectations of, oh, well, listeners would be more like me that are more inclined to go and visit, but then I realized, wait a second, the podcasts that I listen to, do I visit their websites? And
Yeah,
the
no, I
answer,
go to their social media.
yeah, and you're exactly right. I'm more inclined to go to their social media, or if I do go to their website, it's for a very particular reason. And so again, the nature of what a podcast is it's not a forum. It's not in podcasting in its traditional sense is a one-way medium, and now we're encouraging it to become a two-way conversation. And again, having said that, we've had that. Obviously, we've talked about the people that we've met and do engage there, but it surprised me that we don't get a little bit more. For example, we have constantly asked people. Again, I guess I'm going to make the third plug for this now, and that'll be the last one. To go and take the quick survey, the listener feedback. And we would encourage you to do that. We have not had anywhere close to our 250 listeners give us that feedback. I know that if we had a larger sample from our listening base, we would we take every answer there seriously. But B, having enough of it to see what the pattern is would help us a great deal in terms of continuing to tune the podcast for what makes it more what our listeners are looking for. That they will find not just interesting and informative, but hopefully they'll find entertaining.
Right. If you have I'm making this number up, but if you have 3 responses, that looks the results should look dramatically different than even if you have 25 responses. So
Correct. And so again, I would encourage you if you haven't taken the time to do that. And I understand, I get it. You're probably listening on your phone. I know, well, we get reports on what devices are being used. You're probably listening on your phone or on your smart speaker, which means guess what? You are not in front of a computer. So I understand you have to stop and either take the time to do that. But for example, if you're listening on the phone, you probably can click from the show notes and actually interact with the survey directly there on your phone. So you can use the same device for that matter while you're listening. Click
yep.
the link and go and do
you're
it.
not driving anywhere right now.
That's true. That's true. Don't do that while you're driving, which ironically, especially for those of us in the United States, and I'm sure it's elsewhere in the world, I actually drove somewhere yesterday for like the first time I've left my house probably in a week and been behind the wheel of a car, which felt really strange, given that I live in a city that is very much about vehicle transportation, not public transit, to be in that mode. But I guess one thing that surprised me, if you haven't been to the website, we would just encourage you to go do that. And there's lots of ways to provide feedback there. We do get topical suggestions, which are very interesting. Just one came in within the last 48 hours that was interesting to me from the person giving a little bit of their background. And believe me, we'd love for our folks to do that more. What else has been a surprise, Lex?
Nothing else has really been surprising. I want to reiterate that this has been a really enjoyable experience. Again, not to harp too much on the current situation that we're dealing with, but given the fact that I said this yesterday, the last 18 days have been the longest month of my life, and we're only halfway through it. Feels like April is never ending. But having a chance to be able to do research and do things like that has been a really welcome distraction from binging TV or doing something that wasn't necessarily mind stimulating, so to speak.
Right. No, I totally agree with that as well. It's even what we're doing now. We're doing this recording on a Saturday morning. With the distance apart that we are, which is about an hour's drive. Is it's a distraction from other things that I could be doing, and there's just not as many other things to do, given the status of where we are. And again, when we actually suggested, folks check it, we do want you to check in. We really do want to know what's going on, and I know I don't know the names of all of those listeners, but I'd like to know what's going on, where they are, and that they're faring well. So I said we try not to drag this on or make this go on for much longer. Is there anything else you would? As a podcast turns 50 episodes old, you would want to communicate to its listeners, Lex?
Here's to much more than 50 more.
I agree. In fact, it's interesting, when I chose the numbering scheme for the podcast, I intentionally, put in something that would work well in the file naming scheme and all that for going beyond 100. There's 4 digits there. Theoretically, we can do 10,000 episodes before I have to break the mold. And if we live long enough to do 10,000 weekly episodes, that will be a really long time. But
hey, let's shoot for it. Why not?
Yeah, there you go. But I agree. The 50 has been quicker, I guess, than I thought it would be too.
It totally has. 25 came really fast, but I feel like 50 came faster.
Yeah, I agree with that. And and part of it is, we go through ebbs and flows of the production process of sometimes getting 3 or 4 episodes recorded and ready to roll, and they're just scheduled to be released on their release date. And then other times it's, we release on Thursday mornings and it's Tuesday. There's not an episode yet. Who's doing that? What are we doing? Kind of. I've been thinking about doing things. I just haven't sat down to do it, kind of thing. And so we're getting better about, getting ahead of the curve on that. But every week comes around really quick. That's the good news. But there are sometimes I'm like, I wish I didn't have to wait a week to release that episode. I know that's sitting out there, 2 weeks down the road. I wish I could release that now, kind of thing. The problem is, if I release it now, we'd have to have something
to back it up.
2 weeks from now, exactly. So that's part of what goes on there. Well, again, we just wanted to take a quick break. This is not going to be released in the regular episode cycle. I'm going to release this under a different sort of thing, just sort of, an update at 50 or some kind of thing. So it'll actually release before the 50th episode because of the way that I know that I will build it into the mix. The 50th episode, which I recorded literally about 30 minutes before Alexis and I starting to record this, and did things to it and got it uploaded for distribution. Here's a sneak peek for those of you that will be listening. It's actually on something that relates to Texas history. It's also centered around the time and date that's there, and literally the location that's mentioned in here, which happens to be the location of the battle that won Texas independence, is less than 6 or 7 miles from where I sit right now at most. So, sometimes the podcast goes way back in time and way far away distance-wise, and sometimes the podcast is really close to home. And so the 50th episode will be something that's really close to home. So I'm going to ask one last time if Alexis has anything she wants to share before we sort of close out things.
We mentioned we briefly mentioned our social media as well as our website. I want to encourage people to check in with us on social media as well. If you're not inclined to go to the website, please go to our Facebook, go to our Twitter, check in with us that way. Because again, we just want to hear from you.
Yeah, and social media is a good way for people to share them finding us. For example, each week, for those of you that, I'll use Facebook as the example here. We have a page on Facebook. And so one of the things that happens, I think, pretty religiously, I think I'm almost, I'm not 50 for 50 for that because we didn't do it early on, but pretty much since we started posting at least a note about each show on the website, I'm like 43 for 50 because I know the first one there was around episode 7, is that we will post a note to the Facebook page each week when there's a new episode, reminding folks that are there. Well, you can do what I do on my personal Facebook feed. You can do on yours, which is share that post.
Yep.
And that's a good way to get the word out. Twitter is not as much my thing, but I've tried to be better about that. Again, social media is Alexis's thing. So, she can.
One of the things.
She can tell you a little bit more about tweeting, but we would just encourage you to get the word out that way. And provide the feedback again through social media. Not as you well point out, Alexis, it's not just through the website, but social media. Some of the comments, for example, that we have back are comments that were made on the Facebook page. That's a valid way to provide us feedback. And
I know there's a couple listeners that have actually been surprised when I've actually responded to them on Facebook. I am checking Facebook and I will respond to you.
Yeah.
So will Don, so will Dad.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And one thing I'll mention there, for example, just a couple of weeks ago, I won't call out the person on Facebook, but mentioned, I think you had posted a photo back in the recording studio, the fact that you were recording the episode here, and they immediately went to, so I guess we're going to, something in English history, which what was cool about seeing that post for me is that clearly told me that's somebody who's familiar with the podcast.
Yep.
You wouldn't have known that necessarily otherwise. And so to see somebody, oh, I know what that means, that was sort of cool to me. Maybe cooler than it should have been. But it was
cool to me too.
It was sort of, oh, okay, I know what that means. And you sort of said, well, yes and no. If you don't know the answer to that question, check episode 49 out. But to me, that was sort of a cool thing. So, yeah, I agree the social media aspect. We don't want to drag this on. Again, we just want to thank you again as listeners. We wanted to take just a couple of minutes to record something here really quick that would be relevant as well. So that's what we've done here this morning. And I guess into the afternoon as we slide here on this Saturday. And having said that, I've asked you twice if you had anything else, so I'm going to ask a third time just to make sure you don't have anything that's burning in your head.
What's burning in my head currently is lunch. It's lunchtime.
Okay, sort of the same here. and so we'll get cracking on that, and wherever you are in the globe, whenever you're listening to this, I hope you enjoy your next meal as well. And again, we just want to thank you for being part of the community and listening. So until next time, we'll talk at you then, and via the website and the other means that we've talked about here, you can talk to us, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.